can certainly start. So good afternoon, good morning. We have people joining us from the United States. We have people joining us from the Netherlands, from Hungary, but the majority of the people are joining us from around South Africa. And it's wonderful to see people from Durban, people from Cape Town, and of course from Greater Johannesburg, and really a warm welcome to this workshop of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Center in partnership with Yad Vashem. With us, many educators from all around the world, with us, many academics, some Holocaust survivors, second generations, many docents and guides, and of course, team members of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, and the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center. So I am very grateful. Sorry, there is a noise on my side. Let me do something quick, not to get the noise. Sorry. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Thank you. I'm so sorry. That is the problem of working from home. The internet is working. So welcome to my home. But it is wonderful to work with our colleague David Deutsch, Dr. David Deutsch, that is here from Yad Vashem, to put together these fantastic series, 3 parts workshop that started last week, hosted by the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center, looking at Yad Vashem pedagogy and how do they use the testimonies and all the wonderful resources to teach about the Holocaust. Today, we are going to host Sheryl. We are so excited to host Sheryl Ochayon that I will introduce to you very quickly, officially, and to look at women. And the name of the workshop, of course, The Spark of Light, to be a woman in the Holocaust, tells us about the exhibition that Sheryl is going to look at, but also testimonies and how to teach about women when you teach about the Holocaust. Of course, it's so important to teach about individuals rather than about just numbers, and that is what Sheryl is going to help us with. I want to also tell you all that today, the 17th of March, marks the 2nd anniversary of the opening of the permanent exhibition of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. We are all at home. The center is open. We are starting to welcome some schools, and we will love to welcome your school, but we also continue to teach online. So please feel free to use our space and to use us in collaboration with Yad Vashem, our great partner, to teach about the Holocaust. So thank you for helping us to celebrate today's anniversary together. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Sheryl Ochayon. Sheryl Silva Ochayon holds a JD from Harvard Law School and a BA in history from the State University of New York at Binghamton. After working for many years as an attorney, she reinvented herself as a Holocaust educator, beginning by guiding in the Holocaust History Museum at Yad Vashem, which many of you know as the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem. And then she spent 7 years working in Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies, Educational Technologies Department, where she developed online courses taken by students all over the world. She edited and contributed to the online newsletter of Yad Vashem and created educational videos for the Holocaust Education Video Toolbox that I think most of you used, and you feel as if you know Sheryl, because Sheryl, I saw you in all those videos and I feel that I know you so well through poetry and art and so much more. Sheryl has represented Yad Vashem in different contexts, both in the US and in Israel, speaking at seminars, international conferences, and at the United Nations. She's also currently the program director for Echoes and Reflections, a program that empowers American middle and high school educators to teach the Holocaust. And we participate in many of those wonderful workshops that is a partnership between the ADL, USC Shoah Foundation, and Yad Vashem. Sheryl, it is a great honor to learn from you. It's a great honor to partner with Yad Vashem. And the floor is yours. And I just invite everyone to post their thoughts, comments, and questions in the chat box, and we will certainly get to them. Sheryl, the Zoom is yours.
Tali, thank you very much. And thank you all for this very, very warm South African welcome. It's wonderful to be with you. A shout out to Dame Helen Hyde, who was one of my students in the internet courses. When you said students from all over the world, absolutely. And a shout out to Bob McCormick, who I know is a familiar face, who was in one of our Echoes and Reflections seminars. So I feel right at home here. So without any further ado, I will share my screen with you and we will get right into it. And this is it's a subject that is near and dear to my heart, not only as a woman, but as a mother, as a daughter, as a sister. Women, the story of women in the Holocaust, it really is a story that needs to be told. And there are many of them, many of them. So I'm going to start you off. We will definitely talk about the Yad Vashem exhibit because it does contain a lot of personal stories, and I will definitely touch on those stories. Tali, I'm sorry, I should have asked you before. Am I speaking for an hour?
Yes,
I'm sorry.
yes, feel free to speak for an hour.
Okay. Sorry for that breach of custom, whatever. Okay, I'm going to start you off with this wonderful photograph of an unidentified woman from the Kutno ghetto that was taken by Hugo Jäger, who was actually one of Hitler's personal photographers. And the reason why I start with this photo is just because this woman is so beautiful. She's breathtaking, I think, in my opinion. Here's a woman in the ghetto. She sees a photographer and she gives him a big, fresh, warm smile, which tells you a lot about women, about how they tried to help themselves in the ghettos, in the camps, who they were at bottom. And I love this picture also because it's in color, of course. So it bridges the gap. We're 80 years after the event now almost, and black and white pictures is what most of us have in our heads. So to see a picture like this really kind of brings you it makes it so much more current, is what I'm trying to say. And so I'm going to start with a question. And the question is it legitimate to focus solely on women? Going back some years ago, the answer was definitely not. No. You cannot just focus on women, and there were good reasons for that. The reasons being that when you consider that the final solution was intended as a total genocide of the Jewish people, that it really didn't matter who you were. If you were Jewish, you were targeted to be annihilated, no matter your gender. And of course, there was always this nagging doubt that if you focused on gender, you would distract the audience, the researchers, the students from the systematic murder of all of the Jews. And that would somehow diminish the importance of the Holocaust and deflect attention from Nazi policy. So I'm here to tell you that things have definitely changed since the mid-'80s. You'll be happy to know, because these days we understand that when you study gender and when you specifically focus on stories of gender, you can get a much more nuanced understanding of what happened in the Holocaust. And just to give you some examples, we know that the lives of Jewish women were always endangered because they were the agents of fertility. They were mothers, they were women, they were caretakers, and the Nazis focused on them because they were the agents of fertility. This is a picture, a very well-known picture from Skidi in Latvia, where about 2,800 Jews from Lipaia were massacred right on the Baltic Sea. This is a picture in the winter. This is December of 1941. And most of the Jews who were massacred there were women and children. But if you take a look at this picture, what is the import of this picture? You can see one of the ways in which women will be humiliated much more than men, because men really don't have a problem stripping down to their underwear. It's not a humiliation. Remember that these women were usually religious women, Orthodox women, whose own families had never seen them in short sleeves or a short skirt. And here these women are forced to strip to their underwear. And I cannot leave this photo without telling you their names, because these are women that we have identified through Yad Vashem. This is the Purvey family. You see Fruma in the middle is the grandmother of this little family here. Two of her daughters, Rosa and Malka, or Mia Epstein. We haven't identified the one who is standing to Fruma's right, but take a look all the way to the left and you will see Sorella. I'm sorry, this is a picture that makes me very emotional, because when you look at Sorella, you see the humiliation. She cannot even pick up her face to look at the photographer, and he must have said to her, "Look here." But she's hiding behind her mother. And why? Because she is witnessing the abject humiliation of her entire family, of her mother, of her grandmother, the matriarch of the family. And so you see a picture like this and you understand immediately that the experience for men was much different than the experience for women. Again, because the Nazis saw women as the agents of fertility, women were the element that needed to be exterminated, because you can't have women around. You have to prevent the rise of future generations. The Holocaust also produced dilemmas that were unique to Jewish women, circumstances that were unique to Jewish women, and many times an individual's ordeal, how she goes through the Holocaust, was shaped by the fact that she was a woman rather, and the fact of gender many times produces different responses. So this is a picture of Fanny Chaim from Ionina in Greece. And if you take a closer look at her face, this is the moment when Fanny was ripped away from her mother. And you can see the emotion on her face. You can see what this parting means to her. When, you know, a lot of the male voices that we hear don't necessarily stress this moment. I'm thinking, for instance, even just about Elie Wiesel, who writes in Night, "This was the moment I was parted from my mother and Tzipora forever," after he hears men to the left, women to the right. You see the emotion on her face. It is not it's so weighted. There's so much baggage here. I think you understand what I'm saying, even though I'm searching for words. So let's just go through very quickly some initial gender differences, and then we'll really get into the stories. You know, initially, both in the West and in the East, it was the men who were targeted for humiliation, for arrest, for incarceration. And here you see two photos, the bottom one from Baden-Baden on Kristallnacht in 1938, and the top one on the right from Poland in 1939, where, you know, you see very clearly that it was the men who were being targeted. It was the men who were subjected to this treatment. But think about the effect that that has on the women. The men are the ones who are endangered. The men will soon be very afraid to go out onto the street. The men will be the ones who are hiding at home. And so it's going to be the women in all of these cases who are the ones who have to kind of pick up the pieces and make sure that they can feed their families, make sure that they can take care of their families. And that you can see that in these next couple of graphs that I'll show you. The pink, of course, sorry to be so gender obvious, but the pink lines are the women in the ghetto. This is the Warsaw Ghetto population, 1939, 1942, and then a smaller age group at the end of at the end of January 1942. You can see the disparity that actually increases with time, and that's because men are taken to forced labor, taken away, arrested, and never return. And so there's an increase in the number of women as opposed to the number of men. Same thing in the Lodz ghetto. You can see that at the beginning, actually before the war in 1931, the numbers start off, they're very even. By 1940, there's a big change, and especially in that age group, that 20 to 25 age group, because men are constantly being taken to forced labor. And so women will have to provide for their families. They will have to figure out what to do in this situation. Emanuel Ringelblum, who we know collected documents and had an archive called the Oinig Shabbos, or the Oinig Shabbat, under the streets of Warsaw. He wrote in his diary, women's perseverance, the main providers. Men don't go out. When a man is seized for forced labor, the wife does not let go. She runs after the kidnapper. She screams and cries, please, mister. She's not afraid of the soldiers. The women are everywhere since the men have been taken to all sorts of work. The wife has to be the sole provider. Women who never thought of working out of their homes are now performing the most difficult physical work. You can see that women, when they are left alone to support their families, it's difficult. It's not an easy situation for them to be in. You can see this woman in this picture, which I believe is from Szydlice, from the deportation. She's bedraggled. She looks exhausted. She's got, you know, what's she carrying, and the child who's holding her hand and crying. How is she going to care for her family? This is really a big question. This is another quote from Emanuel Ringelblum, who really talks a lot about women in his diary. The future historian will have to dedicate an appropriate page to the Jewish woman in the war. She will take up an important page in Jewish history for her courage and steadfastness. Thanks to her, thousands of families have managed to surmount the terror of the times. So all of this responsibility is going to fall on women's shoulders. I'll give you another example of the difference in gender responses and gender situations. We know, for instance, that unmarried young women in Germany in the mid-1930s, when they saw what was happening and they saw Hitler coming to power and they saw the increasing laws that were being passed against the Jews one after another, there were a lot of parents who told their sons, escape while you can, flee. But most of the unmarried young women stayed with their parents rather than escaping. That was a very female thing to do. And we know this because the transports from Germany, the final transports from Berlin to the death camps, are almost all women, especially older women with their daughters. I'll just give you one more example of these big gender differences. In many Eastern European households, women are the engines of acculturation. What do I mean by that? You can see in this picture, the boys learned in cheder. And what did they learn? They learned religious texts. They learned in Yiddish. It was the girls, if in enlightened families, because it wasn't clear that everyone would send their daughters to school. But if the family was enlightened enough to send their daughters to school, especially in that interwar period between the two wars, then women were going to usually be sent to public schools. Now, if you were going to a public school in a place like Poland, of course, you're not going to learn in Yiddish, you're going to learn in Polish. And that learning of the language, the Polish language, was very important because it was Polish language, it was Polish culture, it was contacts with other girls at that time who were Polish girls, Aryan girls, Christian girls. And that will make things a lot different for these women when and if they need to hide, they need to smuggle themselves out of the ghetto, for instance. It's also interesting because it's another reason why more women than men became successful couriers. And what do I mean by couriers? I mean, these were the women who were a lifeline in the ghettos. They smuggled in arms and information and periodicals from youth movements. And they smuggled out, many times they smuggled out children, they smuggled out even adults. They were connections from place to place, and they were able to do that because they knew the language, they knew the culture, they were much more able to pass as non-Jews. So just to show you their names, this is Tema Schneiderman and Lonko Kuzhibrodska and Bella Hazan. And there were many others. So you have some idea of the differences in the gender and the nuances that we can see with these gender responses. So this is a quote by Mary Felstener that I think expresses the situation very well. Although all Jews faced the same ultimate fate along the stations toward extinction, each gender lived its own journey. So we're going to explore what women faced along this journey towards extinction, because women were targeted just like men were. And that's what we're going to see. We're going to look into some of the stories. This is from the exhibition. Women in the Holocaust applied their minds to a place that deprived them of their minds, brought strength to a place where they had no strength, and in a place where they and their families had no right to live. They marched all the way to death and invested every additional moment of life with meaning. It is their stories we wish to tell and their voices to hear. So with that, little introduction, I am going to launch into our exhibition called Spots of Light, to be a woman in the Holocaust. The exhibition is really the small stories. We're not talking here about politicians, and we're not talking about the women who, Gizzy Fleischman, and women who maybe, made a, had a movement, or were part of a larger, what we're talking about here are the intimate stories, the whispering level, the choices that women made in the face of this evil, brutality, and hardship that they had to deal with all the time. And of course, I think the first thing that comes to mind will be motherhood, because as a mother, the need to save children is going to place women in the face of terrible, terrible dilemmas. And you will see that all along, whether it's in the ghettos, whether it's in the camps. We know that there were a lot of women who chose to die rather than abandoning not just their children, but also their own mothers. And we see this on transports, we see this at Auschwitz, and I will tell you some of those stories. The first story that I'll tell you comes directly from the Spots of Light exhibition. And what you see here is Genia Judzki from Sosnowiec, Poland, or Sosnowiec, Poland. And I love the picture of her sitting, they must be in the Alps, with her husband Bear, or Bronik. Genia and her husband survived selection, and with their son. They had a son named Michał, or Michael, and they survived the selection in the ghetto, but in August 1943, the Sosnowiec ghetto was liquidated and Genia's husband was murdered. Genia and her son now have to figure things out for themselves, and all of the weight of providing for Michał, or Michael, I'll call him Michael, is on Genia's slim shoulders. And they managed to get to the Aryan side because Genia is fluent in German and French. Genia was a very intellectual woman, a very studied woman, educated woman. She spoke both German and French. She learned at the Sorbonne. And this is a picture with Michael before the war. So she turns him over. Ultimately, she finds a place for them on the Aryan side, and she turns her son over because she's got to make a choice now. Is she going to provide for him? Can she provide for him? What she decides to do is turn him over to a Polish woman named Bronia, and she asks Bronia to care for Michael as though he were her own son. In the meantime, she finds herself a job running the household of a German physician. The doctor at some point is instructed that he must relocate to Vienna, and he offers to bring Genia along. And now Genia has a real choice because Michael is placed with this Polish family. What should she do? Should she take him with her? Before I tell you what she decides to do, I want to read you a letter that Genia writes to Bronia. Dear Miss Bronia, it is hard for me to write to you. Lately, terrible things have been happening to me. Life is too cruel. Miss Bronia, I beg you, look after my son, be a mother to him. My dear Bronia, give him everything with all your heart, and I will be grateful to you until the end of my days. He is so clever, and he has a good heart. I am sure that you can find in your heart to love him. Michael should eat as much as he can, for who knows what is to come. He must be strong and able to endure great suffering. Please make sure that he dresses warmly and that he also wears socks. I cannot write any more. My tears have all dried up. May God watch over you both. Kisses. And I will show you what she writes to Michael, Michale. My beloved Michale, are you playing with other children? Are you getting along well with Miss Bronia? Write me a few lines every day. That way you'll learn to write me long letters. Take care of yourself. Sleep in the warm pajamas that I gave you. Kisses, mother. This is the type of situation where you hear from her letter. I mean, he was very young, and I don't know how much he would have understood anyway. But sleep in the warm pajamas that I gave you is like a hug, like from afar, because that's the best that she can do, to tell him to sleep in the warm pajamas. I'm sure that her heart was breaking. What winds up happening is that Genya's identity is revealed. She's taken to prison, and Michael is placed in an orphanage. He's taken out of Branya's house and placed in an orphanage. And now the Gestapo is telling Genya that she is going to be deported, and she's got another decision to make. Should she get Michael to come with her? Should she ask them? And that's actually the decision that she makes, because she's afraid for his future, for his life. If she leaves him in that orphanage, she takes him with her. They are both deported. They are taken to Auschwitz, both of them, and they both perish there within probably the same day they arrived. Meanwhile, we know that the children in the orphanage were saved. So this is one of those heartbreaking stories that doesn't have a happy ending. But it does illustrate the choices that women had to make all the time. This is a picture of me with a neighbor of mine, Rivka Cohen. This is already 7 years ago. I used to see Rivka all the time when she was walking her dog. And I went with Rivka. I knew that Rivka was a survivor. I went to her house to hear her story, and I actually also traveled with her to Poland. All I can say about Rivka is that she was in her 80s when I met her. And the sharpest memory that she still had was of her mother giving her to a Polish family. She remembered, and I think it probably haunted her for her entire life. She was the older daughter, and her mother had twin girls who were younger than she was. And the memory that was seared into her brain was watching her mother walk away, holding each daughter, the twins, in each hand, while she was left with this Polish family. I don't think that Rivka ever understood. I mean, probably she rationally understood that her mother had done that to save her. But I don't think that she ever got over it, because that was what was always at the front of her mind. So look at these. Imagine if it was that hard for Rivka, what it must have been like for her mother. And I'll tell you one other short story that doesn't come from the exhibition. This is the roundup in France, the Veldiv roundup. I cannot pronounce, I do not speak French, and I will not try to pronounce it. But this was a mass arrest of Jews in Paris in July of 1942. You can see there were 13,000 Jews that were arrested. Most of them were women and children, because the men were kind of tipped off that they should hide. And so the men went into hiding. The women didn't think anything would happen to them, but they were rounded up and they were placed in this winter stadium. That's what the Veldiv means. It was a bicycle stadium. We know that the conditions there were terrible. They were kept there for days. There was no food, there was no water. The bathrooms were not working. It was just a horror show. Most of the people who were deported wound up going to Drancy, and from Drancy they went to Auschwitz. And this is Rachel Jedinak, who survived this roundup. And how did she survive? She survived. She was born in 1934. So at the time of the roundup, she was 8. Her sister Louise was a little bit older than she was, 5 years older. And the way she tells the story, she didn't want to let go of her mother. She was in this place that was not, she didn't understand what was going on. There was chaos, there was confusion, there were police, there was incredible crowding. And her mother understood that they needed to flee, that they needed to get out of there, or at least to save her 2 daughters, she needed to get them to leave. But they were clutching her, as young children will clutch their mothers when they're in an unfamiliar situation. And so what her mother did was she slapped her. Now, think about this for a second. Think about a mother's instinct, which is just to hug your child, to hold them close. And this mother, her mother, understood that the only way these girls would live was if they fled that place as soon as they possibly could. So she slapped the girls and told them to just get out. And they were shocked, but they ran out while the police weren't looking. And that's the only thing that saved them, because her mother was also killed at Auschwitz. So crazy stories about the choices that women had to make. This is a story about a woman who made this choice about her own mother, a daughter who makes the choice about her mother. And we find this story in Marek Edelman's book, where he's interviewed by a journalist, and the book is called Shielding the Flame. Marek Edelman was one of the commanders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And he tells this, it's a tiny little story about a woman named Paula Lipschitz, but I will read it to you because I want you to understand the story here. He says, Paula Lipschitz went to her house and she saw that her mother wasn't there. Her mother was already in a column marching towards the Umschlagplatz. That's the square in Warsaw where the deportations leave from. Paula ran after this column alone. She ran after this column from Leshno Street to Stavki. Her fiancé gave her a lift in his rickshaw so that she could catch up, and she made it. At the last minute, she managed to merge into the crowd so as to be able to get onto the train with her mother. Everybody knows about Korczak, right? Korczak was a hero because he went to death with his children of his own free will. Janusz Korczak was an educator. He could have left the ghetto. He had friends on the other side who were willing to save him, but he was not willing to leave his children. And so he went to his death with them in a train that was bound for Treblinka. So Edelman writes, Korczak was a hero because he went to his death with his children of his own free will. But Paula Lipschitz, who went with her mother, who knows about Paula Lipschitz? And Paula could have easily crossed to the Aryan side because she was young, pretty. She didn't look Jewish, and she'd have had 100 times better chance. So this is one of those tiny, intimate little stories, just a woman named Paula Lipschitz who doesn't really make any difference to history, but look at the choice that she made, because she could not let her mother go to her death by herself. She could not abandon her mother when that time came. Okay, I'm going to move on to women's experiences now in the camp, and specifically at Auschwitz Birkenau. One of the things that we know, Auschwitz Birkenau, and I will explain this to you, Auschwitz Birkenau was one of the death camps, one of the 6 death camps, but it was also a labor camp. At Auschwitz, when you got there, there was a selection. That's what it was called. And in this selection, people were separated. The people who could work as slave labor for the Germans were allowed to live a little bit longer. Most of them did not make it past 3 months. And that was only if you were a non-Jew, because Jews usually died faster than that from beatings, from hard labor, from starvation, from disease. And if you were not able to be a forced laborer, you were sent to the side of immediate death in the gas chambers in the crematorium. And what we know is that people came off the trains, those big cattle cars, they came off onto the ramp, and there was always a medical doctor who was standing in front of them, and he would indicate with a finger or with a nod of his head or whatever it was, who was going to one side and who was going to the other side. And so Judy Weisenberg-Cohn tells us, in hindsight, it is clear that in Birkenau, being a father didn't automatically sentence a man to death, but being a mother with a child, or visibly pregnant, or just holding the little hand of a child, even if the child wasn't your own, meant instant death. What is she talking about? She's talking about the scenes on the ramp, and you can see one of those pictures here, where all of this mass of people come off of the cattle cars. You can see the Nazis standing in front. You can see the Commando Canada in the striped uniforms to the left. But right at the forefront of the picture on the right, you can see a woman. Because she is holding a baby in her arms, she is condemned to go to that side of immediate death. What the Nazis didn't want on the ramp, they didn't want scenes. They wouldn't separate women from their children on the ramp at Auschwitz, because that would have caused chaos. It would have caused a commotion. It would have caused hysterics. And so a woman who was holding the hand of a small child was just sent to her death with that child, even if she could work. So in a picture, in a photo like this, and all of these photographs are photos that come from the Auschwitz album, which is an album that we have at Yad Vashem that was donated to Yad Vashem in 1980 by one of the women who went through this process, Lily Jacob, and found herself in the album. You will see that all of these women are holding children. You can see in this picture also, women are condemned to death because they are holding the hands of small children. And if you look at this picture, which is right in front of the crematorium, take a look at the women with their children, older women, younger women, but take a look at the number of children in this picture and you will understand exactly what I'm saying. One of the women who got off the ramp was named Cecily Klein Pollock. Cecily got to Auschwitz at the end of May in 1944. She came together with her mother, Rosa, and her sister, Mina. And Mina had a small baby whose name was Danny. He was about 2 years old, I think, maybe less than that. And I want you to hear Cecily tell her own story without me mediating for you.
When we arrived to Auschwitz, it was like we had just come into a different world. They opened up those cattle trains. People in striped uniforms came on the train and they started to shout, we should get out and leave everything behind.
My first impression was of the striped-clothed people. So this must be the crazy unit. These were the workers, the Jewish workers that did the job for the Germans.
They would whisper to us, nobody should see, give your child to an old lady. We didn't know what they were talking about.
He told in Jewish, people with children are going to be killed the same day. And as soon as my mother heard that, she had presence of mind to run down. And I was next to my mother, and I couldn't really believe that this could possibly be true. But she ran over to my sister, removed the child from her arms and told her, darling, I just found out that women with children will have it very easy. All they will do, they will take care of the children. But young people will be sent on hard labor, and you know, I'm not so young, I'll never be able to survive hard labor. So she was trying to make my sister believe that by giving her the child, she's going to help her. Before my sister had even a chance to resist or to say, no, I don't want to give the child up, my mother had the child in her arm, and she was pushed to the side where all the women with children and older people were standing. My mother had only a chance to yell out to me, please take care of your sister. My name was Silly. This is how she called me. And she called out, Silike, take care of your sister. Because she knew the pain my sister will suffer when she'll find out where she took her grandson.
It's a difficult testimony to watch. Cecily Klein Pollock actually wrote a memoir, and this photo is in the memoir. And in this photo, she actually found her mother, Rosa. That is Rosa, holding Danny. And of course, it was only if that photo was probably taken just a few minutes after the separation that Cecily describes. And within a couple of hours, neither one of them was alive anymore. Another story that we hear comes from Ruth Bondi. Ruth was from Theresienstadt, and she actually worked in the children's block in Birkenau, taking care of 5- and 6-year-old children. And there was a point at which the Germans needed labor. They needed hands. What they did was they said to the women, you can present yourselves for selection. and you can become a forced laborer, or you cannot. And according to Ruth, of about 600 mothers of young children who were then in the Birkenau family camp, and I should explain why there were young children in the camp, because I just told you that young children were generally murdered. Theresienstadt was a special case because the people who came from the Theresienstadt ghetto were kept alive for 6 months, just in case there was a Red Cross, in case the Red Cross visited the camp to see what was going on there. And so these children were kept alive for 6 months. But the mothers, there were 600 mothers, and only about 2 of them decided to save themselves and present themselves for forced labor. Everybody else decided to stay with their children, even though they knew that they would be sent to the gas. And this next story that I want to tell you comes from Echoes and Reflections. Well, the witness comes from Echoes and Reflections. The next story is Itka Zygmuntovich. And Itka, I'm sorry for the blank screen. Itka was born in 1926. She got to Auschwitz in 1942, which would have made her how old? 36 would be 10 and another 6. So she was 16 years old when she got to Birkenau. She was brought there from the Warsaw Ghetto. She had a younger brother, Srulik, and a younger sister, Cecil. She was the oldest. And she gets there with her mother, and listen to the choice that her mother has to make.
They took away my little brother, Srulik, my little sister, Cecil. My mother and I were sent to decide to go to the camp. When my mother saw that they took away my brother and sister, she turned to me and she said, Yitkolo, you're a big girl. I have to go with the little children. I can't leave them alone. But remember, my child, no matter what will happen to you, don't become bitter and hateful. Don't let them destroy you. It was the last time I saw my family.
So Itka's mother sees that Itka is 15, 16 years old. She can presumably take care of herself, and she decides to go where they're sending all the little children and all the older people, and that's the last time Itka sees her. So that was the choice that her mother made. Okay. These are very difficult stories, and they're difficult stories to tell as well. So I think what we should do is we should take a little bit of a break here and maybe think about things that are slightly less heavy. And so I want to talk to you about womanhood. This is also from the Spots of Light exhibition. Women and femininity, women and womanhood. Womanhood is a great part of your being as a woman. Your femininity is very important to you. And what we're going to see here is that women are definitely affected by dehumanization much differently than men. Women survivors, many times, a man, when he's asked what was the experience that is really drilled into your mind that you most remember about survival in the camps, many men will say the hunger. And women, for instance, many women will say the filth, okay? And that kind of just gives you a sense. So at a place like Auschwitz, I'm sorry to go back to Auschwitz so quickly, but at a place like Auschwitz, where you see, the women who were selected for slave labor in the camp, they are stripped of everything. This is the huge contrast. It's a glaring contrast between the Holocaust and between womanhood, because the Nazis are trying to take everything away from these women, and they are going to have to struggle, not just to stay alive, but they're going to have to struggle to remember who they are, and to remember that they are women. So things like womanhood maybe are indulgences, but femininity is going to be a basic component of personality. And that's why when the Nazis removed women's hair, including all the hair of their bodies, from the top to the bottom, they deconstructed these women's personalities. And of course, this was done intentionally. It was humiliation, it was dehumanization. And so when the women came out of the sauna, which was the place where they were shaved and they were tattooed, they lost their names, they lost their identities. How are they, if they don't work very, very hard to marshal all of their inner forces, they won't be able to make it, because they will crumble. So just, a couple more photos. And if you take a look at these women, you will see they don't have bras. They don't have underwear many times. You can see what they look like. Take a look at their body language. They're looking down. The way they're holding themselves. Charlotte Delbo, who was a survivor of Auschwitz, a French non-Jewish survivor of Auschwitz, wrote, "In Auschwitz, her old self was stripped from her as surely as her clothing and her hair." And I think, a picture like this, you get a sense. Look at again, the body language, the expression, the women who are hiding their faces, who cannot look up. And I want to just show you a small segment that comes from a video toolbox that was made to discuss the Auschwitz album about this exact experience. Whoops, sorry.
They quickly led us to this place, to some building called the sauna, the Bathhouse. We waited in line for hours. We still had our own clothes and our own long hair. We still had everything. We huddled close to one another. We felt safer as long as we were together. After waiting around for a few hours, we noticed these very strange figures walking around behind the building, behind the wall. And we thought it was some sort of madhouse. We just didn't know who they were. And then it was finally our turn. And we walked into the bathhouse, we got undressed. And there were workers, Polish prisoners, men. We had to undress, and the SS officers were inside, and we were young girls. We were supposed to undress and walk around naked. They shaved us. But everything was happening with awful screams and with shouting, so that we felt that there was nothing we could ask anymore, and nothing to be embarrassed about. We were just in a state of total shock. It happened all at once. There was no more shame or disgrace, just shock. Young girls walking around naked. They were shaving their entire bodies, everywhere, on top and on bottom. When it was all over and we came out on the other side of the building, we realized those crazy people were now us. And we had suddenly turned into animals in every way, because we couldn't even recognize one another. And in that moment we lost our humanity. We lost all. My best friend was standing right next to me and I couldn't even recognize her. That was it. We couldn't recognize each other. And then the terrible yelling started. Olga, Magda, Helena, Rosinka. We were searching for each other. After that, there were scenes. It was just so horrifying, and we were in such despair that all we could do was cry or scream or kill ourselves. So we just started laughing. We were laughing hysterically, just to cope with the horror, with the terror that our own minds couldn't comprehend.
I hope you didn't miss a lot of that video. I saw my internet connection was unstable, so I apologize for that. Again, these things are very heavy. So I want to give you a story that will maybe, I keep thinking to myself, I'm coming to something lighter. And then I get to where I'm going and I realize that it's no lighter. This is Lena Beresin and her sisters, Betty and Anna. Lena was born in Lithuania in 1910. She was married in 1933, and she moved to Kovno, which was one of the big cities in Lithuania. She had a daughter whose name was Shulamit, and Shulamit was born in 1935. In 1941, all of the Jews of Kovno were taken and they were put into a ghetto. And in March of 1944, there was what is called the Children's Action. Now imagine what Lena went through. I'm going to kind of jump from Lena's story to the story of another couple that went through the same type of thing. This is an artifact that we have at Yad Vashem. It's a shoe of a toddler. And you can see there is a date, 1944, and there's also the date of March 27th. The shoe belonged to a little girl named Hinda Cohen. Her parents were also in the Kovno ghetto. Her parents went out to work in the morning, and when they came home, their child was nowhere to be found. Her father, Dov, found this little shoe, which was all that was left from Hinda, and he etched the date in it so that he could preserve it. Now imagine, going back to Lena's story, that Lena's daughter, whose name was Shulamit, she was born in 35 and she was taken in 44, so she was 9 years old. And Lena never saw her again. All of these children who were all taken. She must have had incredible wells of strength just in order to go on after that. But the story that I want to tell you is about what happens to Lena afterwards, and it has to do with underwear. And that's why I'm thinking that maybe it's not as heavy a story. But you saw in those pictures from Auschwitz, a lot of these women with the body language who are clutching their shirts closed, who don't have brasiers, okay? Sometimes you associate underwear, you associate bras with seduction, with hygiene, but there are cases where underwear can make you feel human again, right? And apparently that was what Lena needed, because Lena was taken to Stutthof, which was a labor camp also. And Lena didn't have a bra. And I guess she was longing for a bra. She was a seamstress. So she was thinking in her mind how she could possibly get it together to make a bra. And this is the bra that she made, which is also an artifact that we have at Yad Vashem that shows up in the Spots of Light exhibition. How did she do it? She says her sisters they were issued men's overcoats, men's jackets, with the sleeves had lining in them. So she tore the lining out of the sleeves of her sister's coats. So now she had fabric. She was given a men's shirt. So she removed 3 buttons from that shirt. And then she found a woman who had found a needle in her jacket. Now, what did she have to pay for this needle? She had to pay a full day's ration of bread just for that needle. So now she had something to sew with, and she unraveled thread from the ribbon that was around her blanket. So now she had thread and she had a needle, she had fabric, but she had to cut the fabric. Now, where are you going to find scissors, right? But then she thought about it, and she thought to herself, I can use a piece of glass. And she went looking around and she found a shard of glass, and that was what she used to cut the fabric out. She cut it, she sewed it, and she wore this bra for 7 months until she was liberated in January of 1945. And she says all the other women in the camp were so jealous of her. Okay, so a little bit lighter. Apropos, women were, they were always, again, femininity, womanhood, even on the brink of death. This is a great quote that also appears in the exhibition. Women retain their femininity no matter what, even on the brink of death. The prisoners asked the seamstresses to cut fitted prisoner gowns and blouses and to add collars and cufflinks to enhance their appearance. The camp commander, SS Sturmbannführer Hirsch, found out about the alterations. He burst into the sewing shop and roared at us, "You Jew bitches, you're sentenced to death and you're being coquettish?" Which is think about this for a second. Why is it so important? If these women really truly were sentenced to death, which they were, why is it important for them to feel that they look a certain way, to feel like a woman, to feel this female, that they still have some of their female wiles that they used to have? So I want to tell you about Helen Reba, who you see in this photo. This is a picture of Helen actually after the war. She was born in Jalozice, Poland in 1918, and she got married when she was about 21 years old to a man named Manik Apt from Benjin, who was mobilized for the army immediately after the wedding, and she never saw him again. When the ghetto in Jałozice was established, she fled to Zakopane and she became a seamstress. She was a seamstress and she accepted sewing jobs from Poles. She manages to escape to Plaszów and then to another camp. She's ultimately caught and she is given a uniform. And Helen finds, you can see this is the uniform that she was given. We have this in the Yad Vashem Museum. You can see the cross on the back to identify her as a prisoner so that these women could not escape. Now you think to yourself, what could you possibly do with a uniform like this that would make it more feminine? She somehow found an orange bead and she put that orange bead, you can see right at the collar of her uniform. And I guess, just looking at something that had a little color, that had a little whimsy to it, was something that made her happy, was something that allowed her to maintain her sanity. I can't explain it any other way. And so she manages to survive, and she gets remarried, and she gave this uniform to Yad Vashem. Again, apropos women still wanting to look nice, even though they're on the verge of death. This is a picture that you've seen before, but take another look at it. Take another closer look at the woman who is in the foreground of this picture. And you see that she is being sent to death because she's holding a baby. But look at the high heels that she's wearing. How can we explain that? Who was she dressing for? What thoughts were going through her mind in the morning when she was deported or when she had to pack herself up and show up at the train station? What was she thinking? We will never know. But the fact that she's wearing high heels and that she manages to keep the baby's clothing white and her white headdress kind of tells you something about how important it was for her to look her best. And many women felt that way. So just to make it a little bit larger for you. This is what women did look like at Auschwitz after their hair was shaved. And this is a Jewish prisoner. You can tell by the word Jude on the side of the photos. So apropos again, the sauna and the importance of hair to women and to how they look. This is a quote from Dina Kirshner-Siegel. In 2006, I remember that we stood naked in the sauna in line to have our hair removed, and I wondered, what are all these men doing here? We couldn't recognize one another anymore. I approached one of the Jewish guards and asked him if he would have a word with someone so that they wouldn't cut off my pigtails. And he replied that so long as I had a head, hair would grow, while if I didn't have a head, I wouldn't need hair anyway. Just to put things in proportion. But that's how important hair was to a lot of women, and a lot of the artifacts that we have. This is another artifact from the exhibition. Margot Fink, that's a picture of Margot after the war, which is why she has so much hair on her head. You can see her number from Auschwitz. She was actually a German Jew who was born in Cologne. Her parents were deported to Zbanchin in 1938, which was on the border between Germany and Poland. And she was taken to the Reichenbach camp, where she actually she was hiding, then she was found, she was captured. She worked for the Phillips Company, and she made this comb from Reichenbach out of wire. Now, of course, if somebody had found this comb, she probably could have been killed or, as she says, severely punished. But think about how important that must have been. It must have been to have this sign of being a woman, that she was willing to risk her life for it. And we have a number of artifacts like this in the Yad Vashem Museum. Okay. I'll tell you just a couple more stories and then we'll wind up. Some of the best stories are about food. And think to yourselves, those of you who are going to celebrate Passover in another week, or those of you who are going to celebrate Easter, or whatever holidays you celebrate, whatever you eat at home, think to yourselves, I mean, I know my recipe book, for instance, all of my recipes say mom's this, or, my sister's chocolate chip cookies, or whatever it is. We hand down recipes from one to another, and we share recipes with our friends, with our families, with our mothers. And a lot of times these are things that are part of us, and these are things that help us remember who we are. And so it becomes very important. And in a lot of camps, we find that, women were cooking with their imaginations because they didn't have food. They were usually starving. But a lot of times, and we find this in more than one camp, women liked to trade recipes. I will submit to you that they are not trading recipes just because they're trying to think, what would this taste like? What would this, what they're trading recipes because they are remembering who they are. They are remembering home. They're remembering my mother made such a great apple cake and we used to eat it on Shabbat and with a cup of hot tea. They're remembering who they are. And that's one of the things that gets them through. It's one of the things that helps them. That's what they're thinking about. They're eating with their thoughts, but they're also remembering who they are. So this is Yehudit Aufrichtig. Yehudit had, she was one of the women who had a collection of recipes. And this is a recipe book that she had. She says, we had low quality white paper. We took out a large sheet and folded it into small pieces. I brought a thread and a needle and sewed it so that it would not come apart, and we wrote in it. I will never forget how a Dutch woman told me, I have peerkugel, write it down. I replied, I've never eaten it, so I don't long for it. She insisted, but it would give me such pleasure to talk about it. So I did her a favor and noted it down. The objective was to satiate our need for food. If you are hungry, you don't care about anything but food. So it's remembering who you are, and it's also, this thinking about food and dealing with food and somehow, again, cooking in your imagination. This is actually what you see here is a recipe for rice souffle. By cooking rice in milk and adding egg yolks and sugar and raisins and ground almonds, lemon rind and beaten egg whites, and baking it in a buttered pan. That's what the actual piece of paper says. And this is also a wonderful story. So I didn't tell you about Yehudit. Yehudit was born in Hungary. She was a Hungarian Jew. She had worked in Amsterdam as a nanny for a Jewish family. And when the Germans occupied, she was studying to be a beautician. And she had a false passport, but she actually became a member of the resistance, and she distributed forged ration cards and food. She was betrayed by a Dutch woman, and she was deported in 1944 to Westerbork and then to Ravensbrück. And she was put to work in a Siemens factory. And she and her friends, what they liked to do was they liked to write fantasy recipes and fantasy menus. And there was one day where Yehudit was too ill to actually get her own food. She had to stay in the Revere, or the makeshift hospital, whatever it was. And so her friend Edith Gambush brought her, at the end of the day, brought her the bread that she had not been able to get at the bread distribution, and wrote this whole thing to her. Dear Julie, which is what she called her, I'm very sorry that we didn't spend the day together in our lovely hall and didn't have our meals together. To allow you to get at least some mental pleasure from our meals, I'll give you the details of the menu. Now, of course, we all know the reality was they had one piece of bread, right? And that was what Yehudit missed the distribution of. But what Edith writes her here is a whole long, you would see this on the menu of a great hotel, right? Breakfast, Carlsbad style, eggs, butter, cheese, jam. At 10 o'clock, we had yogurt, a deep fried yeast pastry, and a radish. Then for lunch, potato soup with sour cream and laurel leaves, asparagus and sour cream and breadcrumbs, sunny side up egg, and beef and tomato sauce with macaroni, fried apple and vanilla sauce. Listen to all of this description. These women were so hungry, and again, it just did them good to talk about these things. Chocolate milk with whipped cream, and egg bread with almonds, and a hornet's nest. Marrow, fried potatoes with onions, salad with green onions, little cookies, black coffee. We gorged ourselves. We ate everything apart from a little slice of bread, which we saved for you. So there's humor in this also. And I think I'm going to wrap up now, just in closing, just to say the choices that women made and the way they chose to keep themselves together, to hold themselves together, the choices that they made to care for their families, to maintain their humanity, to maintain their femininity and their image of themselves as women, these were the things that helped them to survive. And that's what makes women's stories not only different from men, but stories that are very nuanced and do give us a completely different view of the Holocaust experience than if we were only hearing stories that were told by men. These are just very, very different stories. So with that, I will close and say thank you very much for listening. And I will stop sharing. And if anybody wants to ask me any questions, happy
Thank
to
you
take
so
them.
much. Absolutely, Sheryl. This was absolutely brilliant. And as people are putting their thoughts and questions in the chat box, just bringing these individual stories, to the fore, telling us about Paula Lipschitz that we never heard about, but now I will remember Paula Lipschitz, and I just wrote down so many names that you actually told us. So now we have so many teachers here and docents, and maybe let me start with, because I have a lot of questions, but maybe Sheryl, if I have 15 hours to teach about the Holocaust, can I teach the 15 hours using women's stories? In other words, can you talk to us about how do you teach a curriculum using a gendered view, as you told us? And maybe if you don't mind to extend that, and I will ask you another question. There were lots of taboos, things that we never spoke about until maybe 10, 15 years ago. Rape, sexual abuse, and other things. Should we talk to our learners about those issues?
Tali, those are very big questions. To be perfectly honest with you, I have never tried to teach the Holocaust only using the stories of women, because even though I think that they are important, I do think that it is important to remember, again, those points of contention at the beginning, and the reason why women's gender studies in the Holocaust was really verboten until the 1980s, because would it take away from the totality of the experience? I mean, the point of teaching the Holocaust is teaching about the fact that there were 6 million Jews who were murdered, and the Nazi plan was to murder all the Jews wherever they could find them. So it's not just to murder the women, it's to murder the men as well. I think also that while I love these stories, and while these stories show such depth of emotion and things that are specific to women, I think to tell a complete picture, you need both. I think you do need both, because men suffered in different ways. Men had different experiences, and the woman's story, I think, complements it. So I think those nuances are very important, but you do want to get the entire picture. So that was the first question, and the second question has already escaped me completely.
I'm just wondering about the taboos. There were so
right.
many issues that were never spoken about. Do we teach about them?
Right. So, of course, it will depend who your audience is, of course, because you're not going to talk about rape. Men were raped in the camps also, by the way. Of course, women were raped a lot more, but I remember when I was training to guide in the Yad Vashem Museum, there is a story about Roman Frister. Roman Frister was he was a Polish boy. He was sent to a number of camps, and finally to Auschwitz. And at Auschwitz, he was raped, and he was a serial rapist, basically, who his MO was to rape young boys by giving them bread, and they would be eating the bread as he was raping them. And then what this rapist would do was he would take their caps, And the point of the story was that Roman Frister, after this whole thing happened and he discovered that his cap was gone, he had to make a decision, because if he showed up to roll call the next day without his cap, the likelihood was that he would be killed by the Germans. And so he was also put in this horrible situation of having to make a decision whether he was going to steal someone else's cap and save his own life, or whether he was going to show up to roll call without a cap. And why am I telling you this story? The bottom line is that Roman Frister decided to steal someone else's cap, and he actually wrote his autobiography. He wrote a memoir that is called, in Hebrew, it's called The Cap, The Price of a Life. But the reason why I'm telling you this story, I'm having a senior moment, hang on, is because we were always told when we were guides, don't tell that he was raped. You can tell that he didn't have his cap. Okay. When you're guiding groups, you can tell the story. He didn't have his cap. He couldn't show up. He had to make this choice, but there's no reason to go into the rape. I mean, that's what we were told. These days, when I tell the story, I tell the complete story because it's part of the story. And I think it's very important. But again, I usually don't talk about rape. I don't talk about the horrible things that happen to women in that context, not because they're still taboo, because they're not taboo. There are a lot of researchers who spend a lot of time on these issues, but I just find that there's so much other horrible, horrendous, day-to-day stuff that happened to these women, that many more of them had those experiences than had the, the sexual harassment or rape or those experiences. So I leave that stuff to the researchers who are working on it. I really don't go near it.
Yeah, and it's difficult with, in our curriculum in South Africa, the Holocaust is taught for 14 years old, 15 years old at the 9th grade. And those choices need to be made. As you said, what do you share? However, I think what you gave us today is, and this story about Roman Frister is about the dilemma. So perhaps to ask, what would you, this is the story. What should he have done, and what were his choices? And that is wonderful. Thank you. There are lots of wonderful comments that you will enjoy, and we will of course send you many of those comments. For example, Eva Widawski-Ope is saying, thank you, made me think of my mom who was in Auschwitz. I always look at photos in case I see my mom, so looking in photos of women in Auschwitz and looking for your mom, and she's wishing you Chag Sameach.
You too.
Yeah. As people putting a lot of comments and a lot of thank yous and so on, I see Carol Shaw is saying the rapist in Roman Frister's book got his punishment or whatever. He was murdered by the inmates and strangled by the leg for all to see. So do you tell that? When you tell the story, what the cruelty that you were so emotional when you told us the stories. So as a teacher, perhaps, reflect a little bit of what do you tell and where do you stop?
I think you tell enough to get a message across. A lot of the times you want to tell the human story, but you don't necessarily, I'm not going to say you don't need to tell the whole story. What I'm going to say, I'm going to put it differently. I'm going to say that the most important facts, and a lot of time, a lot of times we all know we have time trouble. I mean, there's only so much that you can pack into an hour or, whatever it is. So you really have to be very judicious and be very careful with what you choose, the facts that you choose to tell. And I think, especially with these women's stories, what was important for me to get through to the audience was the choices and the difficult situations that women were put in. And so those were the stories that I told, and that was what I focused on. It all depends on the message that you're trying to put across.
Absolutely. And maybe if David and you will be so kind as to put in the chat box some of the links to the exhibition and to the testimonies, or send to us, and we will send to all those that registered some of the links, because I do think many of the teachers here are saying that's wonderful. We can actually, as you said, not teach only about women, but indeed include women's stories that many times we don't, when we talk about resistance, when we talk about resilience, when we talk about humor. Let's bring all those stories. And maybe finally, if I may ask the last questions, again, you have, let's say, only 15 hours and you have to teach the story of the Holocaust, and you do bring some stories of women. How do you teach that it will not be Auschwitz centric? That you will teach about women in Ravensbrück, or women in Plaszow, or women in, that you did. You brought us some stories and the differences between a tattooed arm, shaving of the hair that was not done in Plaszow, for example. How do you teach about the differences and the complex story of the Holocaust?
Okay, well, I'll just, take you through my thought process for this particular presentation. I wanted to use material where I would have visuals for you. I wanted to use testimonies because I wanted you to hear these women speaking. And a lot of times we find, there were 60,000 people who survived Auschwitz. So there are many more testimonies from a place like Auschwitz than from a place like Plaszow, which was a smaller camp. Some of my favorite stories, because I guide in Poland, so some of my favorite stories are actually from Krakow, from Plaszow, the stories of resistance. It really depends where you're trying to go. And today, I really wanted to show you, we have all of those great Auschwitz album photographs, and that was a very stark decision that women had to make, life or death. If we had spent more time, I could have spent more time on the ghettos, and told you lots of stories about what women had to do to feed their families in the ghettos, how women in the Lodz ghetto, women had to actually destroy their furniture because most of the houses in the Lodz ghetto were not connected to, they didn't have heat. They weren't connected to cooking gas. And so women actually had to destroy their furnitures to make fires in their houses or right outside their houses so that they could cook. And it took them hours and they blew on the flames. And why did they do this? Just to keep their families alive. There are so many stories to tell. Today was really just about showing you things and having photographs. But I could have, I could go on and on and on and on about any number of things. And women's resistance is one of my favorite subjects. So don't even get me started.
I think another workshop about women in resistance is in the making. I'm just saying, But as you said, Sheryl, there is so many stories, and you gave us such, I think, richness of examples from Auschwitz and Plaszow and Warsaw and Sosnowiec and, and France. And I don't even want to go to all the examples. But for me, and as we are closing, and please do look at the chat and we'll save it and share with you, because the teachers and the educators are really saying, this is useful. We are going to use it in the classroom, talking about choices, eye-opening. Sibongile is saying very useful, eye-opening presentation. Thank you. And you will see so many of those messages. And I think that the greatest gift, I think, was that you really showed us that with photographs and identifying the names of the Epstein family that will never be remembered if you did not tell us about the Epstein family. And then one of our staff members, Shirley Gilbert, said her son-in-law is actually an Epstein, and it could have been from the same area and the same place and the same surname. So, bringing us those individual stories and showing us the wide variety that Yad Vashem can offer the educator through your testimonies, online exhibition, and resources. And for that, Sheryl, I'm so grateful in the name of all of us, the three directors of the Holocaust and Genocide Centers in Cape Town, Durban and Johannesburg, Heather Blumenthal, Mary Kluk, and myself. all the teams, all the volunteers. And of course, thank you to everyone. And thank you to David Deutsch. Thank you so much for organizing this and for partnering with us. And Sheryl, thank you for sharing your wonderful, wonderful experiences and knowledge. Can I come to Krakow with you?
Sure.
So, that's the next thing. But my father was a prisoner in Plaszow, so we can explore it together. So that will be amazing, and hope to see you all next week. Next week will be a virtual tour of the Yad Vashem Museum with our own friend and colleague, Dr. David Deutsch. It will be hosted by the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. And if I understand correctly, we will not be able to record it. So please do come and join us and watch it live. And we will work together, I'm sure, in the future. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a lovely evening, lovely day, and see you again very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Sheryl.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David.